What kind of love reveals itself not through grand public declarations, but through a quiet gesture waiting at the edge of dawn? In a world where cameras never seem to stop flashing and headlines chase every movement of two of Korea's most recognizable stars, the most unforgettable moment between Song Hye-kyo and Lee Min-ho did not happen on a red carpet. It did not unfold on a film set. And it did not involve a crowd of cheering fans. Instead, it began in silence. A long night had finally come to an end. The lights of the city still glowed faintly beyond the curtains as the first hint of morning slowly approached. For Song Hye-kyo, the night had been exhausting. Filming schedules had stretched late into the early hours, leaving her with little more than a few precious moments of rest before another demanding day would begin. The world often sees the glamour of stardom. What it rarely sees are the quiet sacrifices behind it. Endless rehearsals, late-night scripts, early morning calls that come before the sun has even touched the skyline. That night had been one of those nights. When she finally returned home, fatigue followed her like a shadow. The kind of deep exhaustion that settles into the bones after hours of work under bright lights and intense expectations. There was barely enough time to set her phone aside before sleep quietly claimed her. But morning was already preparing a surprise. Somewhere in that quiet apartment, while the world outside slowly began to wake, Lee Min-ho had already been awake for hours. Those who know him often describe him as calm, thoughtful, someone who expresses care not through dramatic gestures but through small moments that reveal themselves unexpectedly. That morning would become one of those moments. The apartment remained still as the first light of day crept through the curtains. When Song Hye-kyo finally stirred from sleep, the room felt different somehow. Not dramatically different, just enough to make her pause. There was a faint scent in the air. Fresh coffee. At first she assumed it was simply her imagination. After all, exhaustion can play strange tricks on the senses. But as she sat up slowly, another detail appeared. Soft music drifting quietly from the living room. Curious, she stepped out of the bedroom. And that was when she saw it. Waiting on the small dining table near the window was something simple yet unmistakably thoughtful. A carefully arranged breakfast. Fresh fruit placed neatly beside warm toast. A small cup of coffee still sending thin curls of steam into the morning air. But it was not just the breakfast that caught her attention. Beside it was a single handwritten note. Moments like this do not need elaborate explanations. They carry their meaning instantly. She walked slowly toward the table, the quiet of the morning wrapping around her like a soft blanket. Outside, the city was beginning to move again. Cars passing. Distant sounds of people starting their day. Inside, everything felt calm. When she picked up the note, the handwriting was immediately recognizable. It was from Lee Min-ho. The message itself was not long. In fact, it was remarkably simple. A few lines written with the kind of sincerity that cannot be rehearsed. He wrote that he knew how hard she had worked the night before. That he hoped she would start the day slowly, without rushing, even if the world outside demanded otherwise. He reminded her to eat before reading scripts, to drink her coffee while it was still warm, and most importantly, to remember that even the busiest lives deserve moments of peace. There was one final sentence at the bottom of the note. A quiet reminder that someone was always cheering for her, even in the mornings when the world felt heavy. For a long moment, Song Hye-kyo simply stood there holding the note. The breakfast remained untouched. Not because she did not appreciate it, but because sometimes the emotion of a gesture arrives before the action itself. And in that moment, the realization settled slowly. The world often sees their lives as stories filled with fame, luxury, and public admiration. But this was something different. This was a glimpse into the quiet spaces between those headlines. A simple morning, a handwritten message, a breakfast prepared before the city woke. Later that day, people close to the couple would describe the moment as something that perfectly captured the nature of their connection. Not loud, not theatrical, but deeply thoughtful in ways that only those closest to them truly understand. Lee Min-ho had already left for his own schedule by the time she woke. There were no cameras to capture the gesture. No reporters waiting outside the door. just the quiet evidence of someone who cared enough to make the morning a little easier. And perhaps that is what made the moment so powerful. Because in an industry built on spectacle, where relationships are often discussed in dramatic headlines and intense speculation, the most meaningful expressions of affection often happen far away from public attention. A simple breakfast, a handwritten note, a silent act of encouragement waiting beside a window touched by the first light of day. For Song Hye-kyo, the morning became more than just the beginning of another busy schedule. It became a reminder that even in lives filled with scripts, cameras, and constant expectations, there are still moments where everything slows down. Moments where love reveals itself not through grand declarations, but through quiet gestures prepared before dawn. And somewhere across the city, as Lee Min-ho stepped into another demanding day of his own, he likely never imagined that such a small act would become one of the most unforgettable mornings she would carry with her. Because sometimes the simplest gestures speak the loudest, especially when they arrive just after the longest night. Morning light continued to spill slowly across the apartment, turning the quiet room into something almost cinematic. For Song Hye-kyo, the moment felt suspended in time. The world outside had already begun its usual rhythm. Phones buzzing, production teams preparing schedules, assistants coordinating meetings and rehearsals. The relentless pace of the entertainment industry never truly sleeps. Yet inside that small space by the window, everything felt unusually calm. She finally sat down at the table. The coffee was still warm. For a brief second, she imagined the early hours of the morning before she woke up. Lee Min-ho moving quietly through the apartment, careful not to wake her. Preparing breakfast with the same patience he carried on film sets. Writing the note slowly, choosing words that felt genuine rather than dramatic. It was a scene that few people would ever witness. And perhaps that was exactly why it mattered. As she took the first sip of coffee, the warmth seemed to cut through the lingering exhaustion of the night before. The long hours of filming, the demanding scenes, the constant pressure to perform perfectly all began to fade into the background. Sometimes rest does not come only from sleep. Sometimes it comes from knowing someone noticed how hard you tried. The breakfast itself was simple but thoughtful. Fresh fruit arranged carefully. Toast that was still slightly warm. A small jar of honey placed beside the plate, as if someone had taken the extra moment to think about what she might like. There was no extravagance, just attention. And attention, in many ways, is the purest form of care. While eating, she glanced again at the note resting beside the plate. The handwriting carried the unmistakable character of Lee Min-ho. Calm strokes, slightly slanted letters. The kind of writing that looked as thoughtful as the words themselves. It reminded her of the many conversations they had shared over the years. Long discussions about work, quiet reflections about fame, moments when both of them admitted that success, while rewarding, often comes with a strange kind of loneliness. The spotlight shines brightly, but it rarely allows people to see the quieter parts of a person's life. Actors are often expected to appear strong, composed, untouchable. But behind every performance is a human being navigating doubts, fatigue, and the constant pressure to remain extraordinary. That was something Lee Min-ho understood deeply. And that understanding had slowly built a bond between them that fans could sense, even when it remained largely private. After finishing breakfast, Song Hye-kyo carefully folded the note and placed it inside a small book that rested on the living room shelf. It was not a dramatic gesture, just a quiet way of keeping something meaningful close. Outside the window, the city was now fully awake. Traffic flowed through the streets. People hurried toward offices and studios. Somewhere across the skyline, Lee Min-ho was already immersed in his own demanding schedule. Filming crews, script readings, meetings that would stretch from morning into late evening. Yet the memory of that early morning gesture traveled with her throughout the day. Later, while preparing for another scene, a member of the production team noticed something unusual. Song Hye-kyo seemed lighter. Not dramatically different, but calmer, more relaxed, as if the heavy fatigue from the previous night had been quietly replaced by something warmer. Actors often carry emotions into their performances. Personal experiences have a way of shaping the subtle expressions that cameras capture. That day, the warmth of the morning seemed to follow her onto the set. When the director finally called for a break between scenes, she briefly checked her phone. There was a message. Simple. Just a short line from Lee Min-ho asking whether she had eaten breakfast. She smiled when she read it, because the answer, of course, was already sitting in the memory of that peaceful morning by the window. It is easy for the world to imagine romance as something dramatic. Candlelit dinners, public declarations, grand surprises designed to capture attention. But real affection often lives in much quieter moments. A note written before sunrise. A meal prepared without expectation of recognition. A message sent simply to ask whether someone remembered to eat. These are the gestures that rarely appear in headlines. Yet they are the ones that linger the longest. As the sun moved higher across the sky and another busy day unfolded, the story of that morning remained private, known only to the two people who shared it. But for Song Hye-kyo, it became something she would remember long after the cameras stopped rolling and the lights of the studio dimmed. A quiet morning, a thoughtful gesture, and the simple reminder that even in the middle of exhausting nights and demanding careers, someone had taken the time to make the start of her day a little brighter. Sometimes love does not arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits patiently on a small table near a window, beside a cup of coffee still warm from the moment it was poured.